In the course of the past 3.5 years, the Democratic Party has done everything it could to suppress popular opposition to the Trump administration. And there is enormous popular opposition to prevent the development of a movement of workers on the basis of their class interests against this government of the financial oligarchy. And instead, they channel it all behind the reactionary anti-Russia campaign and the claim that the greatest threat to the American people was not the ruling class in this country, but Vladimir Putin. And you'd have to conclude, actually, on the basis of the whole campaign that they were waging, that one of the first acts the Democratic Party would do upon taking office would be to wage a war against Russia.
Joe Kishore, welcome to Primo NUTMEG.
Thanks, glad to be here.
So you are the National Secretary for the Socialist Equality Party, as well as the 2020 presidential nominee of the party. I just wanted to start off the interview by letting you introduce yourself to the viewers and listeners. Who are you and why are you running for president this year?
Yeah, well, you said I'm the National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party. I'm running along with Narissa Santa Cruz, who's a vice presidential candidate in the 2020 elections. The Socialist Equality Party is the U.S. affiliate of the International Committee of the Fourth International, which is the worldwide Trotskyist movement. We publish the World Socialist Web Site, WSWS.org, and we are fighting to build a socialist movement in the working class, to build a political leadership in the working class under conditions of growing social convulsions, certainly which will be intensified by the coronavirus crisis. But we're fighting to build a socialist movement, an internationalist movement, a revolutionary movement in the working class, which is based on the understanding that all the fundamental problems confronting mankind, ecological disaster, world war, social inequality, the growth of authoritarianism, that these are bound up fundamentally with the capitalist system. That capitalism is the disease that has to be ended, and that the alternative is socialism, the reorganization of economic life on a world scale to meet social need, not private profit.
So how long has the Socialist Equality Party been around for, and have you folks fielded presidential candidates in the past?
Yes, well, the Socialist Equality Party held its founding Congress in 2008. It was established earlier in 1995. It was previously the Workers' League. Our movement has a long historical tradition. It is the Fourth International, which was founded by Leon Trotsky in 1938 to oppose Stalinism and the bureaucratic degeneration of the Soviet Union. That is the movement that exists and continues to exist today, and the Socialist Equality Party represents that in the United States. We have run in elections before. We generally run in the presidential elections. The aim of our intervention in the elections and our campaigns is to utilize the election to build a political leadership. Our orientation is not fundamentally to electoral politics in that sense, although we seek to get on the ballot and get votes, but we're using the campaign as a means of fighting the Democrats, the Republicans, to fight for the political independence of the working class, to build a political leadership, a socialist leadership in the working class. One of the points I just would perhaps make, when we launched the campaign, we made the point that it was not just oriented towards workers in the United States, that it was oriented to the working class throughout the world, that the problems confronting mankind are global problems, not national problems, that the interests of workers all over the world are fundamentally the same. And we're oriented, therefore, in our election campaign itself to the international working class and building a socialist movement in the international working class.
The reason I ask about the history of the party is just because there are several different socialist parties in the United States. There's Communist Party USA, the Freedom Socialist Party, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, Socialist Party USA, Socialist Workers' Party, Workers' World Party, and more beyond those. Do you have any insight as to why there are so many different parties?
Well, there are political differences between different parties. I mean, you mentioned several of the different organizations that exist, but there are fundamental political differences, and one has to examine the history and program of a party in order to judge its character. If you take, for example, the Communist Party of the United States, its origins are in, or it's a Stalinist party, but particularly it has functioned for many decades as a auxiliary organization of the Democratic Party, essentially part of the Democratic Party. If you take perhaps what is the most widely known organization that calls itself socialist, the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, it is a faction of the Democratic Party. It's actually just today, it's one of its members, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the congresswoman from New York. It was announced that she's now part of a unity task force to promote the campaign of Joe Biden. And she's participating in a task force with John Kerry, the former Democratic Party presidential candidate, on climate change, pro-war, militarist presidential candidate of the Democratic Party. So the DSA is really nothing but a faction of the Democratic Party. It's not socialist in any sense of the word. It serves primarily to provide something of a left cover for the Democrats and for a right-wing militarist party of Wall Street. So there are political differences between different organizations that may call themselves socialist. One has to judge an organization not by the label it utilizes, but by its history and its program. The Socialist Equality Party, our history, as I was saying, is the Trotskyist movement. That is the continuity of revolutionary socialism, of Marxism in the 20th century. Our movement is based upon opposition to all forms of nationalism, to reformism, of course, to Stalinism. We have a long historical tradition of the fight to unify the working class on an international scale against capitalism. And that really distinguishes us from all of the different movements and parties that you referred to, all of which, are, say, in one form or another, either they're both national in orientation, and they're oriented towards bourgeois politics, not the development of a genuine working class movement based upon the perspective of revolutionary socialism. But you have to, of course, go through, you have to examine a party's history, including our own history. And the Fourth International has a long history, principled history of the fight for revolutionary socialism, which I think very much corresponds to the needs of the present period. We live in a revolutionary epoch. We live in an epoch in which global problems predominate over national problems, where every problem is a global problem, and where the solution to the crisis confronting mankind is international socialism. And that's the perspective that we are fighting for.
So I also have to ask about the Green Party, because they are probably the most dominant left-wing party in the U.S. They have also recently adopted the eco-socialist term and are really rebranding themselves as an eco-socialist party. So why shouldn't voters be supporting the Green Party and the Green Party presidential nominee?
Well, the Green Party has always sort of served as something of an auxiliary outside organization of the Democratic Party. Their line has always been, well, you have to support the Green Party in order to pressure the Democratic Party to the left. In the president election campaign, they're very much presenting themselves as the continuity of the Sanders campaign, but somehow formally outside the Democratic Party. Where Sanders wanted to have a political revolution within it, the Green Party is going to carry out the same policy, but nominally independent of the Democratic Party. But they have essentially the same perspective. I think in certain ways the Green Party serves as a sort of halfway house, particularly for socialist organizations that call themselves socialists, like the DSA or Socialist Alternative. Socialist Alternative also really promoted the Sanders campaign and claimed that it was a vehicle for implementing a political revolution. Then when, Sanders, as he did in 2016 and now is doing again in 2020, inevitably does what he says he's going to do, which is support the establishment candidate, in this case Biden, and in 2016 Hillary Clinton, then they say, well, now let's perhaps support the Green Party. It's a sort of, as I said, a certain halfway house between elections and between support, open support for the Democratic Party. But the politics is not. There's no principal political differences between, say, the DSA, which is operating within the Democratic Party, and the Green Party, which is nominally independent. You had actually recently Bhaskar Sankara, the editor of Jacobin, which is affiliated with the DSA, declaring that he is going to vote for the Green Party in this election. This is someone who is, in fact, deeply embedded in the Democratic Party. The other point I would make in relationship to the Green Party is, first of all, it's a capitalist party, while it has adopted the so-called eco-socialist label. And it's a party, a political organization, which, whenever it has come to power, has adapted to the politics of the ruling elite. Perhaps most famously in Germany, where the Green Party came to power in the 1990s, and Joschka Fischer, the German Green Party head and foreign minister under the Social Democratic Party Green Party coalition government at that time, became the first foreign minister in Germany to lead a military intervention outside of Germany since the Second World War, and that was the intervention in Yugoslavia. But that's the logic of the politics of the Green Party. It really is not a party which is opposed to capitalism. It's a sort of electoral party which combines a sort of series of eclectic series of proposals for reforms with a perspective which is entirely oriented towards the capitalist state, and is not in class terms. It's a bourgeois party, and also it's a party of the middle class. It's not oriented towards the development of an independent political movement in the working class, and the fight for socialism against capitalism on a world scale. I would also say it is a very national-oriented party.
So I do have to ask, too, just because Howie Hawkins, who is the front runner for the Green Party nomination, is also the nominee of the Socialist Party USA. He had also, I believe, ran for the Party for Socialism and Liberation's nomination against Gloria La Riva. So I'm just curious, has he attempted to reach out to your party at all and run for your party's nomination, or do you have any thoughts on him seeking other parties' nominations?
I'm not familiar with the other parties he's seeking nominations for, but no, he hasn't, and he wouldn't, and we wouldn't want him to. There are, as I said, there are fundamentally different political perspectives involved. The Socialist Party USA, again, is a similar organization as Socialist Alternative or the DSA, oriented towards the Democratic Party, towards the Sanders campaign. I would just make the point that there's millions of workers and young people who supported Sanders because they saw him as an instrument for achieving social reform or even socialism. Workers and young people moving to the left, looking for a way to oppose inequality, to oppose the dictatorship of the corporations. But the role of Sanders and those organizations which politically promoted him, and I would include that, by the way, Howie Hawkins. I watched a video recently, and perhaps what was most striking was the absolutely uncritical attitude towards Sanders. As I said, he presents his campaign as simply the continuation of Sanders' political revolution. But those organizations that sort of presented Sanders as somehow the vehicle and encouraged the illusions that workers and young people might have in the Sanders campaign and promoted it, they did so because their role is to maintain the political domination of the Democratic Party. And that's Sanders' role as well. He spoke a lot about social inequality, but actually if you look or paid attention carefully, whenever he talked about the political revolution and explained what he meant by it, He meant bringing workers and young people back into the political system, that is, back into the Democratic Party. And that's what he did in 2016. Again, that's what he's doing in 2020. He sees the growth of social opposition and the enormous social political anger in the country as a threat to the political domination of the Democratic Party, and his role has been to try to maintain that. So I think you have a lot of groups which, are, for instance, auxiliary organizations of the Democratic Party. They facilitate the effort to keep opposition contained within this political institution and within the apparatus of the state as a whole. Our perspective is very different. We're fighting to build a political movement which is opposed to the whole structure of the political system, of the capitalist system, which this state and the two parties defend. That's our orientation, not to somehow try to maintain the political stranglehold of really two parties which are extremely right-wing and increasingly despised by the broad mass of the population.
So I've been lucky enough to have Noam Chomsky on the show a few times, and although he does demonize and criticize the Democratic Party and acknowledges that it is a right-wing party, he's one of those folks out there who says, despite that, we still have to support the Democratic Party because the Republican Party has become essentially fascist at this point, and it's worth making that compromise to stop Donald Trump and the Republicans from going down that road. So what would your response be to people like that who say, yes, the Democratic Party is deeply flawed and maybe even is evil, but it is a lesser evil, and we need to essentially use it as a vehicle of stopping Donald Trump?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's not obviously a new argument. It's an argument which has been utilized in every election cycle, and it's always the same thing: the lesser of two evils. And Chomsky himself has made the same argument many times before. And the argument is always, well, you have to support the Democratic Party in order to stop the Republicans. And of course, the consequence of decades and decades of that has been the shift ever further to the right. Perhaps we could make a couple points in response to this issue. First of all, I think it's important to understand, the Trump administration is a real threat to the working class. Right now, the Trump administration is spearheading a back-to-work campaign amidst the coronavirus pandemic that will, and that it knows will, lead to the deaths of thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of people. It's implementing this policy at the behest of the corporate and financial oligarchy, which, having handed itself trillions of dollars, is now demanding that workers get back to work to produce profits. So the Trump administration, of course, it has elevated outright fascists into the White House, promoted extreme nationalism, authoritarianism. It is a real danger to the working class in the United States and all over the world. But Trump didn't come out of nowhere. The Trump administration is itself an excrescence, the vomiting up of all that is filthy and reactionary in American capitalism. That is embodied in Trump. The Democratic Party does not represent an alternative to that. It is, in fact, another faction of the same capitalist ruling elite. And if you look at how did even Trump come to power, it was a product of the right-wing policies of the Democratic Party. Obama, the candidate of hope and change, who all these so-called left groups and individuals presented as somehow the transformative candidate who was going to transform all of American politics, in fact, carried out the bailouts of Wall Street after 2008 and 2009, implemented endless war, carried out a restructuring of class relations. Now, that created the conditions for Trump, to posture as the demagogue, the outsider. And then you had the 2016 election, the nomination of Hillary Clinton, the widely hated and despised candidate of Wall Street and the military, who, if anyone could lose to Trump, it was Hillary Clinton, and Trump was able to present himself as a candidate of the opposition to the status quo. So the Democratic Party is not, and then of course the other point, in the course of the past 3.5 years, the Democratic Party has done everything it could to suppress popular opposition to the Trump administration, and there is enormous popular opposition, to prevent the development of a movement of workers on the basis of their class interests against this government of the financial oligarchy. And instead, they channel it all behind the reactionary anti-Russia campaign and the claim that the greatest threat to the American people was not the ruling class in this country, but Vladimir Putin. And you'd have to conclude, actually, on the basis of the whole campaign that they were waging, that one of the first acts the Democratic Party would do upon taking office would be to wage a war against Russia. So that is the Democratic Party. The other point I would just make, because this comes up often, look at what happened in Nazi Germany. The lesson of the rise of fascism was the bankruptcy and criminal character of a politics that seeks to subordinate the working class to the ruling class, to bourgeois politics. Hitler actually didn't. I mean, he was given power by the very political forces that at that time were championed by the Noam Chomskys of that day as the essential bloc to the rise of Hitler. So you can't oppose the development of fascism and extreme right authoritarianism by supporting the politics of the oligarchy, by supporting the politics of Wall Street that the Democratic Party represents. It can only be fought through the building of a movement in the working class. The greatest asset that Trump has in his own effort to maintain political power is the continued subordination of the working class to this right-wing reactionary party, the Democratic Party.
So I do have to ask, since you brought it up and it's a topic that I've covered a lot on the show, is there any part of RussiaGate that you think may be true, whether it be Trump colluding with Russia or the Facebook ads that were being put out or the hacking or leaking of emails? Is there any component of that you think Russia may be to blame for? Or is it just that you think that Democrats have really sensationalized RussiaGate?
I think it's a manufactured scandal. It was a very deliberate policy. Actually, even going back before the election, the whole sort of line was that the threat to American democracy was Russia, was Putin. I mean, even by their own, reports. I mean, Russia supposedly bought a couple $100,000 in Facebook advertisements in order to stoke divisions within the United States. I mean, this is a country in which billions are spent by the corporate and financial elite to buy elections. I mean, the threat to American democracy is not Russia and Vladimir Putin. The threat to American democracy is the corporate financial oligarchy in this country. And it has been utilized, and very deliberately, for a number of reasons. First, because the Democrats had certain concerns that Trump was not pursuing the anti-Russia campaign aggressively enough, and also the wars in the Middle East. They saw that as critical to the geostrategic interests of American imperialism. Trump was tending to focus more on China. There were conflicts within the ruling class over issues of foreign policy. The other consequence of the campaign, or a motivation behind it, it's created the conditions for the escalation of internet censorship, for the claim that a fake news spread on the internet by Russia has to be censored, and the claim also that Russia is stoking internal divisions, that all internal conflicts in the United States are the product of Russia. In that context, it has been utilized to justify the persecution of Julian Assange, the fact that Julian Assange remains in prison, in Belmarsh prison in the United Kingdom, faces extradition to the United States, where he could face life in jail or worse. that he's imprisoned under conditions of an expanding pandemic. I mean, that is a crime and it's an atrocity. But it's a crime that has been fully supported by the Democratic Party, and they've utilized the anti-Russia campaign as part of that. But it is a campaign which has been manufactured by the Democratic Party, by the media, by intelligence agencies, in order to justify policies which are in the interest of the financial elite and to fight out conflicts within the ruling class. The conflicts between the Democrats on the one hand and the Trump administration on the other hand have throughout this administration been conflicts within the ruling class in which there is no democratic or progressive side. We have insisted that the working class has to reject any subordination to the to this conflict. I'd always just point, by the way, that Biden, is part. The Democrats' now narrative in relationship to the coronavirus crisis is that they're sort of doubling down on the anti-China element of it. Both Trump and the Democrats are sort of competing over who is more opposed to China. Biden just released a new advertisement in which he escalates the anti-China campaign, which again is an effort to distract attention from who's really responsible, the financial elite in this country, and to create conditions in which the American ruling class can advance its geostrategic interests abroad. That was the aim of the Russia campaign. Now it's a focus on China. Of course, they very well may go back to Russia, but there's nothing legitimate about this campaign.
So returning to your campaign and the issues you are trying to push and advance this year, what are your main issues? What would you really like voters to be thinking about, to be considering?
Well, I think what the coronavirus pandemic has made clear is that the interests of the working class, its very health, its very lives, now in the form of the fight against this pandemic, are inextricably connected to the fight against capitalism. That there's no solution to the pandemic itself, and this is part of a broader crisis confronting mankind, but there's no solution without a frontal assault on the capitalist system, upon the wealth of the oligarchs. I mean, if you consider what is happening now, the Trump administration is spearheading a drive to return to work with the participation of the Democrats and Republicans and Democratic and Republican governors throughout the country. As I said, under conditions in which it knows it will lead to deaths. The most recent estimate from the University of Washington is that 147,000 people will die by the beginning of August, a sharp increase over previous estimates as a result of the policies that are being implemented, the absence of testing, the return to work under unsafe conditions. Here in Michigan, auto plants are already opening up. They're carrying out this campaign, but it is there's a certain, I think, homicidal character to the policy that they are implementing, but it's one driven by class interests. Over the past 2 months, the ruling class has turned over a sum of money to itself, which is unrivaled in history, far exceeding even what was done after 2008 and 2009 under Obama. Trillions of dollars handed out to Wall Street. The stock markets continue to go up even as the death toll rises, as the social crisis in this country intensifies. The markets go up because they're getting unlimited sums of money from Wall Street. But then, the ruling class have engaged in thievery and robbery on a mass scale, bankrupting the country, is demanding a return to work and to make workers pay for it. It will be paid for through an increase in exploitation. It will be paid for through austerity. It will be paid for through a further restructuring of class relations. That is capitalism. And the policy which is being implemented is the policy of the ruling class. And I think there will be enormous opposition. There is immense anger among workers, among Amazon workers and auto workers and healthcare workers, meatpacking workers, where the virus is expanding aggressively, to postal workers, transit workers. All sections of the working class will be impacted by this. And there's enormous opposition that will intersect with the what came before it, the immense opposition to inequality, to war. But that opposition has to be given a clear political perspective. And we are fighting to build, as I said at the beginning, a political movement in the working class, which understands that the problem is capitalism, that the working class has to organize throughout the country, around the world, in a mass social and political movement against the capitalist system itself, to seize the wealth of the oligarchs, to nationalize or turn into public utilities, the gigantic banks and corporations like Tesla, where Elon Musk is, insisting that production must go forward despite regulations against it. These corporations have to be turned into public utilities under the democratic control of the working class, as part of a global plan, social and economic plan based upon the needs of society, not the profits of the rich, not the endless accumulation. The fact that the billionaires are not only maintaining their wealth, but increasing it under these conditions, under conditions of mass death, under conditions of social and economic devastation, that they are increasing their wealth. That is an absolute condemnation of the capitalist system, and that's what has to go. So, in this election campaign, we're going to fight for that perspective, and I think it will get a very broad audience. This is we're going through revolutionary times, and a revolutionary perspective is what is required, and it will get a powerful response.
So, Joe, I did want to ask you a question from one of the show's patrons. Shrek Peters asks, what do you know about the Duma chemical weapons incident, and what are your feelings on the Syrian conflict?
The Duma, there was I'd have to go back and look at some of the they blamed Assad for a whole series of chemical weapons attacks, which were largely manufactured, in which there was a lot of evidence that the Assad government was not behind it, and they used that but they used the Duma, and they sort of mobilized the media, the Democratic Party, obviously behind it as well, as along with the pseudo-left groups around the Democratic Party, sort of accepted the official narrative put out by the American intelligence agencies of what was behind it without any real evidence. And they utilized that to justify their military operations in Syria. I think the broader point that is raised is that, I think this is connected to the anti-Russia campaign, because the CIA was very much opposed to any retreat from its intervention in Syria, its regime change operation in Syria. Their preferred candidate in the 2016 elections was Clinton. They were not really happy, and they had a certain conception that after Clinton was elected, there would be an enormous escalation of the war in Syria, and bound up with that an offensive against Russia. They were not really happy with how the Trump administration, its foreign policy upon coming into office, which was, as I said, it was bound up with Trump's sort of consideration that China was more the immediate threat, and that was very much then behind the anti-Russia campaign. But the operation in Syria, the regime change operation, very much instigated by the intelligence agencies, by the military. I think politically, perhaps the most significant fact is that it received the unanimous support of the pseudo-left organizations in and around the Democratic Party. I would also add to that the Green Party. Howie Hawkins has made a number of statements solidarizing himself with the Syria operation as well as the anti-Russia campaign. But they fully supported it under the grounds that this was somehow a democratic revolution in alliance with the American intelligence agencies. And it was this was a policy of American imperialism. And the groups which promoted it did so very much from the standpoint of their own support for the operations of American imperialism. Of course, Sanders supported it. Sanders, who supported the whole anti-Russia campaign as well. It's an operation which is bound up with the efforts of ongoing efforts of the United States to control the Middle East. And they saw Assad a bourgeois nationalist. We don't support the Assad government, but they saw Assad as an obstacle to the unrivaled domination of U.S. interests in the Middle East, particularly because of his alliance with Russia. So I think that's the broader political issue raised by the Syria events.
And just to return to Noam Chomsky for a moment, one thing that he said on the show that was somewhat surprising to me was that he would support the presence of U.S. troops in Syria to protect the Kurds.
I think that a small contingent of U.S. troops in the Kurdish areas can, not with no capacity to move beyond, barely even armed, or provide a kind of a deterrent to a very possible Turkish assault, which would extend the massive atrocities that they've been carrying out against Kurds.
So to protect them from Turkey, but not Syria?
It might. They're going to have to make arrangements with Syria sooner or later. But the primary concern right now is a Turkish assault, which has already taken place, after all. It's going on inside Turkey. The Turks went into parts of Syria, Afrin, where there was atrocities committed in partially Kurdish areas. If they go on to the rest of the Kurdish areas, it could be very ugly. So I think deterring that makes sense.
Okay. Because the way that I think it was kind of spun was that you would be against the U.S. Pulling out of the civil war that's taking place in Syria. So this
has nothing to do with the civil war. This is a matter of protecting the Kurdish areas where, incidentally, interesting developments have taken place, protecting them from a possible assault by their most bitter enemy, who's been carrying out atrocities against Kurds for many years. Yes, I think that makes sense.
Okay, but as far as the U.S. being involved in the civil war, we should we be or should we not be involved in the civil war in Syria?
Well, depends what you mean by involved. So, should we have been giving arms to the opposition? It's very hard to say. Remember that the Assad regime is a brutal, murderous regime. It happens to be the legal government, but it's responsible for most of the atrocities. Now, at the very beginning, you go back to the beginning, there were peaceful protests, nonviolent protests calling for mild reforms, democratizing the very harsh authoritarian system, some economic reforms. They were met with vicious repression. That set off the civil war. There were forces in Syria, kind of moderate democratic reformist forces, which were trying to maintain themselves, but pretty quickly were overwhelmed by the jihadi elements that were started pouring in. And that led to a very complex civil war with many sides. Should the U.S. have been involved at that point? Well, if there had been, not the U.S., but if there had been any way to protect the actual democratic forces, probably would have been worth doing, but there may not have been such a way.
It just seems, I guess, a little counterintuitive, because you've been so outspoken against the U.S. acting as a global police force, especially in concert with NATO.
I'm not opposed to the police either. If my house gets robbed, I call the police. Okay? I'm against the police when they shoot people. But these social and political world is not an axiom system where there are simple rules that you just follow rigorously. It doesn't make any sense. Life's much too complicated for that. You have to ask about the consequences of the policies you're talking about. So it takes a contingent of U.S. troops in Rojava, the Kurdish areas. I don't want to see U.S. forces abroad. I also don't want to see Kurds massacred. Okay? You have to make a choice sometimes.
And I think that we saw this a bit when Trump was talking last year about taking troops out of Syria. There was a concern on the left about the Kurds. So what is your thoughts about that? Are there instances like that where U.S. forces, even though they may be executing somewhat imperialist purposes in the region, where they could actually serve beneficial purposes as well?
No, American imperialism intervenes for its own interests, the interests of the American ruling class, not for national defense or the protection of peoples. And any, those who seek to justify alliance with American imperialism on the basis of, well, it's somehow going to guarantee the democratic rights of the Kurds or any other group of people, is either exercising conscious deception or is going to be, and I think that would be the case for Chomsky and others, or is going to be in for a really horrific surprise. And particularly the American imperialism's history with the Kurdish people has been an absolute catastrophe for the Kurds. The United States operates on the basis of the interests of the American ruling class, and the fight against American imperialism and the fight against the fight to advance the interests of workers throughout the world, including throughout the Middle East, has to be connected to the fight against American imperialism. I mean, it can't be done in alliance with American imperialism. I think another example of this is the example of Libya. If you recall, back in 2011, under the Obama administration, there was a big hue and cry about, well, including from the so-called left, people like the professor Juan Cole at the University of Michigan, who was very prominent at that time in demanding NATO intervention in Libya in order to protect the people of Benghazi. It was claimed that this was necessary. He said, well, yes, I'm often a critic of the United States, but this is a different situation. Here we face a horrific catastrophe confronting the people of Benghazi. We have to support American imperialist intervention. It was done, the same thing was done back in Yugoslavia in the late 90s. Case of Libya, what has come out of that, an absolute catastrophe for the country, riven by civil war, different factions supported by different great powers. Yugoslavia, similar consequences. This is the product of the intervention of American imperialism. And any effort to have a sort of shortcut to the fight to liberate the peoples of the world from capitalist exploitation by relying on American imperialism ends in catastrophe. And in particular, the so-called sort of left, pseudo-left groups that have been promoted in Syria, the Kurdish groups, have been a catspaw of American imperialism, and there's really actually nothing left about that. So we oppose it. We oppose American imperialism, but we oppose American imperialism from the standpoint of the fight to unify the working class all around the world on the basis of its common class interests. But I think people like Chomsky who they utter various left phrases, or they're critical of American imperialist policy here or there, but in this sort of thing they reveal their true politics, and that's not separate from his endorsement, his call for support for Biden in the 2020 elections. Ultimately, he's not independent of the Democratic Party.
So, Joe, I do understand what your long-term vision is and the issues that you're hoping to bring to the forefront through your campaign. I guess my question would be, what would be your goals in the short term? What do you think the best case scenario is this year that your campaign can accomplish?
Well, first of all, I don't see it primarily in electoral terms. As I said, we will be trying to get on the ballot. The pandemic makes it actually very difficult, if not impossible, and we'll be pursuing efforts to get on the ballot. Already, the ballot access laws are incredibly undemocratic for third parties. You have to get thousands and thousands of signatures just to get on the ballot. As I said, under the conditions of a pandemic, one can't. One would be endangering one's own life and the life of those that one's seeking to get signatures from. So we'll be pursuing mechanisms to try to get on the ballot in other ways. But our aim is, we have a different orientation. Our orientation is not to the state. and to the political apparatus. Our orientation is to the development of a political movement in the working class, to the growth of the class struggle. And I think we're on the eve of really explosive class battles. What is happening in this country is not going unnoticed. There is an immense reservoir of anger in the working class. The vast majority of the population, which is completely excluded from political life, whose interests are nowhere represented within the two parties. And it's to that social force and the intervention of that social force that we are oriented. Trotsky, in his History of the Russian Revolution, states that a revolutionary situation is characterized by the forcible intervention of the masses in world history. That in ordinary times, history is determined by the kings and the ministers and the journalists and the parliamentarians, etc. But in a revolutionary period, the masses intervene and alter the course of historical events. I think that is the force that we are oriented towards, the growth of the class struggle and the building of a political leadership in the working class. I think that there is an enormous potential for that. Our political perspective, the perspective of the World Socialist Web Site, of the International Committee of the Fourth International, the Socialist Equality Party, I think powerfully corresponds to the development of an objective social movement in the working class. And we are fighting to orient it towards that and to build a socialist movement in the working class. So I think that out of this period, I don't know what's going to happen precisely over the next month, over the next 2 months until the election. I mean, I think the political situation in this country is enormously fraught. Whether there even is an election. I think Jared Kushner just yesterday mooted the possibility that there might not be an election in November. I think the political situation is extremely unstable. But within this situation, the most important factor is the growth of the class struggle. And I think that's this is the period that we are entering in, and I think we will through this build our party. And I would urge those who agree with the fight for socialism, to the fight against capitalism, who are opposed to both parties, who want to build a genuine socialist, anti-capitalist movement in the working class, to join our party, to read the World Socialist Web Site and to join our party.
And how can folks do that? How can they follow you, and how can they get involved?
Well, we're at socialism2020.org is our URL for our election campaign. I'm on Twitter at jkishore, Jkishore. Of course, also on Facebook. Narissa is also on Twitter. You can find that through the webpage, socialism2020.org. I would say that, for those who are really interested in our political perspective, read the World Socialist Web Site if you don't already, WSWS.org. We publish every day news and analysis from a socialist perspective. It's unlike really any other publication, daily and global publication from the standpoint of the interests of the working class against capitalism and for socialism. So I'd encourage everyone, who wants to find out more about our perspective to read the World Socialist Web Site.
Well, Joe Kishore, thank you very much for being on the show today, and hopefully we can have you back at some point in the future.
Glad to be here, and then I would welcome it any time.